Okay, thanks for being here. My name is Pascal St-Amour. I'm from Université Lausanne. And this is joint work with Julien Gagné, who's at the engineering school in Lausanne, and Florian Pellegrin, who's at EDEC. Okay, so let's start with a couple of facts that happen as you get older and especially as you approach death. The first one is that people are less in good health. So as you probably know, if you look at people who report poor or bad health, it doubles in the 30 years from 40 to 70, and it doubles again in only 10 years from 70 to 80. Okay, so there's an acceleration in there. If you take the number of survivors, it's going to drop by about 20% in 30 years, and then it drops again by 30% in only 10 years. So there's a big increase in how fast people go. What we know also is if you think of death as a great equalizer, that's just not the case. There's lots of variation across income. This is by decile, and you have about 11 years longevity gap between the very poor and the very rich. Okay, so that's another fact to keep in mind. Also, what we know is that there's two things happening with regards to health expenditure. The first one is that they go up quite a lot. This is the annual amount that's going to be spent between age 70 and 90. This is for all payers, so regardless of who pays. Okay? And if you look at the very last year of your life, it's going to go up pretty high, so about 43,000. It gets really important. So that's the first fact. The second fact is that there's a change in composition taking place with regards to health expenses. So it's not health expenses as we think. And in particular, it's more long-term care expenses that really increase towards the end of your life. Now, we know long-term care is a bit special. For one thing, it's very income and wealth elastic. So it's more like there's some element of luxury good and more elements of normal consumption involved in there, okay? So it's not as curative care if you look at it. This is a picture taken from a recent paper by Maria Cristina Denardi and co-authors, and you could see what's going on. If you look at traditional curative care, like professional service, doctor, drugs, you could see it sort of peaks up at a point and then it's not going anywhere. So the bulk of the expense is going to be related to long-term care, things like nursing and home health and hospice expenses. So, so this change in composition takes place. And we know that Medicare is not covering these expenses, so you can have access to Medicaid if you're poor enough, but that's means tested, which means that your out-of-pocket is going up towards the end of your life, okay? So that's also going to be important. Now, given that you have to face these out-of-pocket, there's also a big drain on financial resources that you have, and wealth is falling extremely rapidly. If you look in the last 3 years of your life, your wealth is going to fall by about 50%. In the very last year of your life, it's 30%. It's extremely rapid how financial wealth is going to go down towards the end. And you can compare this to Survivor, and Survivor is pretty smooth in terms of wealth fall, so it's going to be about 2%. So there's a big gap in how fast your financial resources are going away when you're approaching death over here, okay? Okay, so that's pretty much the data. So let's see what people have to say about this and what we have to say. Okay, so the first element is if you look at the literature, it's pretty much something which is unavoidable. So aging takes place. There's some biological elements involved in that, but there's not much fighting you can do about this. So it's going to deteriorate biologically your health status. That's fine, and there's a mechanical increase in your exposure to death risk as your health is going down, okay? So that part is pretty much what is being said. And given that there's nothing you can do about it, the optimal strategy is just to make things as comfortable as possible, which is why you want to go towards more comfort care and more long-term care. They're trying to use curative care over here. Okay, so that's the traditional story, and of course, this is going to deplete your financial resources, but that's okay. You may want to leave bequests for your kids, but these are going to be more accidental bequests to the extent that your resources are there to help you out finishing the last periods of your life. Okay, so that's the traditional explanation. And we're going to do something very different. So I'm going to get rid of everything which is uncontrollable. So I'm going to bring it back into what the person can do about it. So that's what we do. So forget about aging. I can talk about aging later on. And certainly not going to be something which is ineluctable. So we're going to confront this to more an optimal strategy. So you might think of a soft landing element that you want to do and try to see if there's some things that you can control to make things as comfortable as possible. There's really 4 hypotheses which are there. So if you agree with those, you're going to pretty much agree with the model. If you don't, well, that's a different story. The first one is that what you spend can affect your health. There are ways to change your health level. So you can think, through leisure or expenses, but there's a cost, and you get improvements on your health. So that's the first element. The second one is that health is related to death risk. So there are things you can control and things you can't control. If I go out jogging, I'm improving my health, which means I'll probably have a longer longevity, but I can be hit by a car and I can die up front. So things can be adjusted up to a certain extent, not all, but you can do some adjustment. The third one is that you ask most people in this room, and probably not a lot of people are going to say I prefer death to life. So most people agree, life is good. So we're going to have this built-in feature that people enjoy life. So ceteris paribus, they'd rather live than die, okay, which is fine. And finally, it's got to be dynamically consistent. Now, this is a tough part. Because basically, if I give you an horizon, you can choose your dynamic decisions. If I tell you got 5 years to live, and there's nothing you can do about, the strategy is just running down your wealth for over the 5 years. So you're going to spend, 20% of your wealth over the next 5 years. That's not that difficult. The tough part is when your decisions affect your horizon, because then you have to do it in a way which is dynamically consistent. Okay, so I don't want to deplete things too fast because I know this is affecting how long I have to live. So that makes the problem really, really hard to solve. Okay. So what we want to aim at is get conditions under which people want to close down the shop. In French, it's fermer la boutique, which is probably closer to what we have in mind. So closing down the shop involves a couple of elements. So what it means that optimally, I want to jointly deplete my health and wealth resources, but the two at the same time. So there's got to be an optimal decision over here. The second element, we're going to see a zone where you sort of deplete slowly, and after a while you're going to speed things up. Okay, so I want to get this acceleration towards the end. I've worked in a long old age home for a long time, and this is something I saw, working there. People fight, and after a while they stop fighting and just go zoom towards the end. So I want to get something in there along these lines. Third element is that optimally I know where I'm going, so I'm going to increase my exposure to death risk, but that's fine because I do it in an optimal fashion. Okay, and because of dynamic consistency, I don't want any regret when I approach death. Which means that I'm going to converge to a state where I'm pretty much indifferent between living and dying. Despite the fact that I'd rather live, towards the end I want to be okay. So I want to be at peace. So that's really what we have in mind. Okay, so if we can find these 4 elements, that means we're closing down the shop, and that's hopefully what we'll try to do. Okay, so the framework is based on a paper we wrote 3 years ago. So it's a continuous time paper. Just focus on the main elements. This is a Grossman type health production function. So you have health in here, and you can do some expenses over here. That's the investment. You invest in your health capital over here. You got diminishing returns. So think of this as a Cobb-Douglas technology. And if you don't do anything, well, health goes down by this rate. Now you have sickness as well. So when you have a sickness shock, basically it increases the rate at which health depletes. So we're talking not about headaches, but really bad illness over here that's going to deplete your health stock. Okay, that's what we have in mind. Now, those 2 shocks, which are death and sickness, are Poisson processes, so they have an intensity. You can think of this as a probability of occurrence. So this one is exogenous for sickness, and the original paper we allow to control for this, but I'm not going to do it here. But death is endogenous. So your exposure, if you improve your health, basically you're reducing this probability of dying. So that's what I was telling you. I can control partially my exposure to death, but I can be hit by a car, which is not going to happen often if you're very old, I guess. But this is the part which you can't control. So you can reduce it only to a certain extent. And you got diminishing returns there too, okay? So we're going to allow for an income process. Now you may think, if I think about somebody who's 75, he's probably not working that much. And the truth is, a lot of elders are getting more and more, and this is a basic tendency in the US. They're going back to work, so that's really important. So if this is true, it's got to depend on your health. If I'm not healthy, I'm probably not working. Think of Y0 as Social Security. This is your basic income. No matter what happens, you're going to get that money, okay? Now, I can insure. Insurance over here is a bit special. This is actually fair insurance against health shock. So, I'm buying X quantities. When the health shock hits, so that's this guy over here, I'm getting paid 1 unit for each unit I bought. And this is actually fair, so it's priced at the intensity of the shock, which is normal over here. Now you have a wealth dynamics, which is given by this budget constraint. So W is wealth, which means I have the return on wealth. I can invest in risky portfolios, so there's also a financial decision. I have income, and I subtract my consumption and my health expenses. Okay, so everything so far a bit standard. Now preferences are a mess here. They're tough because the problem is tough. You want to make sure that the person doesn't get into a situation where he'd rather die. If this is so, you're going to start, selling part of your body. And this is what we had in the initial version. So you don't want something like this. So how do you do it? We go to Epstein-Zinn type of preference. This is non-expected utility, okay? In continuous time, it's Duffy-Epstein. So this is what you have. Now, if you're not familiar with this, that's not too much of a problem. This is an aggregator function. So what it means that your exposure to financial risk is penalized with this gamma. Gamma is risk aversion with respect to financial risk. Important parameter is the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, which is different from risk aversion in this setup. And you have a minimum consumption. Keep that one in mind because I'm going to talk a lot about this. Think of this as subsistence consumption that you want to maintain. Now, people might differ in their attitudes with respect to death risk or sickness risk. You might be more religious person, so death risk is not that much of a problem for you. So you want to allow for these differences, for instance. So we want to allow for 3 source-dependent risk aversion: financial, death, and sickness risk. So you don't need to have these same attitudes. Now the key point is that this guarantees that this function is always positive, okay? And that's really important because death is this guy. So this is going to occur at time Tm. And what you're comparing is a flow which has got to be positive with death which is normalized to 0. So you want to make sure that utility is always positive. In that case, you prefer life to death. And you can only attain this with these type of preferences. That's why we use those, okay? Okay, so you can compute the optimal rules, and we do it. It's messy, but it's feasible. So this is how much you spend on your health. There's 2 components. This one is the traditional one, which is depending on your health over here, and this one is non-traditional. It's non-traditional because it's related to this death hedging. I like spend on my health because it prolongs my life, and I like life. So which means I'm going to spend a bit more on that. Okay, and that's going to be the part which is really non-linear. Is going to be important over here. Okay. And it's non-monotone because of these 2 effects. The fact that I can control my health and therefore control my exposure to death is going to introduce some non-monotonicity over here. Okay. Now, there's also consumption that we can compute. And if you look at it this way, that's the important part. You want to make sure you're able to attain subsistence consumption. If you don't, then you're into a real problem, okay? Which means you're going to make sure that this part is above this part. Now, this is net total wealth, financial wealth plus the value of your human capital, which you can compute in closed form, okay, over here. So to ensure that you have sufficient resources to finance subsistence, you have to make sure that financial total wealth over here is positive, okay? So we're going to define this as an admissible zone of the state space where basically you're able to cover subsistence. And as I told you, you get positive utility when this guy basically is above this one. And that's really important. So I have to make sure that this wealth is sufficiently high to prefer life. Otherwise, well, basically, I'd rather die. Okay, so that's the pain point today. Now keep that in mind. That's really important. Okay, so that comes from the homogeneity of the preferences that we use. Okay, so now we're going to focus on changes. This is the change in health, okay, through the law of motion that I introduced. And what I want is to look at depletion regions. So I want to make sure I focus on those regions where I'm choosing to let health go down. Okay, and as health goes down, mortality risk goes up. That's what I want. And I also told you I want to focus on accelerating regions. So this is regions where this derivative is positive, which means that health is going down, so that's negative. And because this derivative is positive, you start cutting down really rapidly on your health expenses. So you're going to accelerate things towards the end to reach that zone where you're indifference between life and death. Okay. And we can do the same with wealth. So that's what we're going to do over here and evaluate this at the optimal rules and get the depletion region for the wealth. Okay, so that's what we have. Now, this is the main theoretical result. There's three conditions that we can need to verify that you're going to have this closing down. If you have these three conditions, basically, closing down is going to happen. So the first one is that health depletes really rapidly. If we're focusing on people near death, that's probably fair. And that's the component of your income which is related to your health. It's probably very low for people who are 70 and so on. So that makes sense. The other one is that the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. Remember, that's not related to risk aversion with these type of preferences. It's got to be sufficiently high. And the final one is that these people consume. When do they consume? When their exposure to death risk is high, if they're really averse to the risk of dying, and if they are really impatient. So that's these elements. So if you have these conditions are fine. Okay, so let's move to the graphical interpretation. I told you there's a point where you're indifferent between life and death. This is this red line. And you can see there's a trade-off between your financial wealth on this side and your health. Okay? So if you are richer, you're okay at being less healthy and being indifferent with life and death. So if you're in this zone, you're fine. You strictly prefer life. If you're in this zone, you cannot cover subsistence level or consumption, and you'd rather die. So that's really the element. So anything that brings me closer to that red line is bringing me towards the point where I'm indifferent between the two. Okay? Now, this is wealth dynamics. So this is a steady state locus, which means, think of this as a bowl and a marble. So if I let the marble roll, it's going to stop at a steady state in the middle. So it's pretty much what you have. In fact, it looks like a bowl. So if I'm on this side, I'm sufficiently rich. That means I'm expecting my health to improve. That means I'm doing the things to move my health upwards. Okay? If I'm in the green zone, I'm in the health depletion region, which means health is going down. And you can see what's going to happen. You're going to hit that wall over here, and you're going to stay there for a while, but you get these shocks. So they keep on moving you in all the directions. You have financial shocks moving you up and down, and you have these sickness shocks which are moving you in that direction. But that's fine. You're sort of hovering close to that steady state region. That's fine. But because it's U-shaped, there's this point, W3. If you're below, there's nothing to stop you, which means once you start being in that zone, you're going towards the death indifference region, okay, which is problematic in a sense. It's not for the agent because everything is optimally decided. I told you there's an accelerating region. It's that zone in blue, which means that you're going down, and you're sort of fighting, but not too much, slowing things down, and then you get into that zone, and then zoom, it goes really rapidly, okay? So you're accelerating the pace at which things are going to approach you to the point where you're indifferent. And you can see it's very related to how rich you are, and the point is what's happening with wealth. Now, under the conditions I told you, wealth is going down, okay? Which means you can be sure, even if you're there, which means you're going to be hovering and close to there, the forces are pushing you towards the bottom, which means everybody at some point will enter that closing down region, okay? So if you're rich enough, you're going to be staying above or closing down, but the optimal choice is to push your wealth down, which means you're going down in that direction, okay? Now, some of you may wonder, what about terminal illness? So if I've got certain form of cancer, what is the optimal strategy? Well, then there's nothing you can do to improve your health because it's terminal, which means your death exposure probability is just a constant, and you probably have more depreciation and your health probability is going up. So what can you do? This is the original strategy. Now, if you can do something, if you can't, well, it boils down to this graph, which means it's everywhere in the closing down regions. Okay, so closing down is always optimal if you are facing a terminal illness. Okay. Now, some of you might be from the policy perspective, so you may say, this is bad. I'd like to try to reduce this. I disagree, but let's suppose we agree. How can you do it? That's feasible. Remember, that point is with Social Security. So what I can do is sort of push up Social Security, which is going to drive this guy down. And it's pushing all the curves towards the bottom, which means that if you were there, you were in the closing down region, you're no longer because of the additional resources. So yes, it's possible to do something. Okay. So we like structural econometrics, so we do structural econometrics, which means we're going to go for the deep parameters. Okay, so all those key parameters I told you, we're going to try to estimate those. It's a trivariate model with health expenses, portfolio decisions, and we have the closed form solution, so we can do the structural stuff. Okay, there's also a bunch of other conditions that are important, but I'll skip those. We use HRS 2002. This is one of the last wave where you have very detailed information on what people do in terms of their health spending. So we're going to use this. And we're going to focus on really elders. So these are people, as you know, HRS is 51 and over. We're going to focus on the latter part, so 65 and more. Okay, so we got about 10,000 observation, mean age 75. So these are old people. Okay, there's no consumption data. That's not completely true. We can use CAMs, but here we don't. And because they're covered by Medicare, I'm going to drop the optimal insurance equation. Okay, so this is the parameters that we estimate. This is the Cobb-Douglas parameters. 69 is low, which means there's very diminishing return to trying to improve on your health. You can do it, but not that much. But still, it's still okay. If you don't do anything, health is going down 7%. If you're hit by a shock, sickness shock, you add a 1.1%. So it's really biting over here. It's going to bite a lot of your health when you're old. Okay, important part is that this guy is significant, which means you can't control your exposure to death risk. Okay, so it's something you can do it. Okay, and this is the minimal consumption. It's about 12,000 per year, which sounds reasonable. And the elasticity is greater than 1, which is what we needed for the results to make sense. Which means that those conditions I was telling you about, they are verified. They have to be negative over here. They are verified, so we know we have the conditions for closing down to take place. Okay, so so we can do some out-of-sample testing, which we didn't put into the model in the estimation. How do we do it? We can compute the expected lifetime that you have in front of you in closed form. So we have this. We have the math expression to compute this. Now, if you look at this, this is based by health. Over here, obviously, the people who are less healthy have a lower expectation, especially if you're in the very low health level. And if you compare this with the data, you can see we're in the ballpark. So even in terms of out-of-sample testing, we're doing fine. Okay, so this is the state space partition I told you about. These are the estimated state space partition, which means those curves are really computed at the estimates I was telling you about. Okay, so what does it tell you? Well, for the bulk of the population, they are in the closing down strategy. In fact, if you are at fair health and more, you are in that region where closing down is optimal. So for the bulk of the population, this is an optimal strategy over here. You can see accelerating region is very low, which means you don't do this all the time. You do this really when you get very, very low in terms of your wealth and very low in terms of your health. Okay, then it's the optimal strategy. Okay, so we do some simulations as well, just to see what's the life cycle properties of this model. And remember, what I told you is to bring down your wealth to close to zero, and especially make sure that your welfare goes close to zero as you approach death, because that's when you become indifferent between life and death. So how do you do it? You do it by cutting down your wealth, cutting down your health over here. The red line is for the poor people in the simulation. The blue line is for the rich ones. So you can see there is a difference, which means that there's going to be a difference in expected longevity. So you might wonder, why is this negative? Because I have people in my simulation that just won't die. So they should be dead, but they're still alive. So that's the reason why I have some things like this. But you can see the poor people are going to die about 3 years shorter than the longer people, the richer people. So at the end, both of them are going to zero, which is what we want for indifference between life and death and dynamic consistency. Okay, concluding remarks. So I told you, we sort of put aging away and focus only on optimality. What if I bring back aging? It's just going to make things worse. In other words, all the results I've shown you without aging are going to be even reinforced if I bring aging. So you sort of put the odds against ourselves, making things really hard. If I bring aging, it's easier. So it's going to happen even faster. So it means optimally letting your health and wealth stock go down. Getting into an accelerating region, which is fine, you can do it. Getting to states where you are indifferent between life and death, so you are comfortable with the fact that you're going to die soon, and that's okay. We could see that you have those conditions which are verified through structural estimation, so we know that those conditions are in. And they make sense for really old age people, high consumption patterns, and they also are able to generate low ability to generate income. It's consistent with all the stylized facts, so the fact that health is going down, that death risk is increasing. There's a change in composition. In our model, this is exactly what's going to happen. You're going to start cutting down on those curative care and move it to consumption, and you have falling wealth as well. It's applicable to terminal illness. It's not a problem. Finally, can you reduce the incidence? I showed you, yes, it's possible. No problem. You can do this. Should you? The answer, as we think, is no. We don't think you should interfere with that process over here. Why? Because you have to go back to the motives why you want to intervene over here, okay? In a way, you can do it through Social Security. I could do it through medical research, but that's also a possibility. So is what we see a result of myopia? No, it's not. It's purely dynamically consistent decision, so there's no myopia involved, no weird utility functions over here. Is it a market failure? No. Everything we do is done under a complete market assumption, so there's no market incompleteness reason why you would want to intervene. Is it redistribution? No, because over here poverty is endogenous, so which means regardless of where you are, eventually you will become poor, and that's part of your optimal strategy. So don't interfere with that, okay? So I guess the end message is, stop thinking about aggressive or excessive therapy towards the end. Let things go their own course, and keep in mind that people have a right to die. So I guess I'll stop here. So, thank you.